As Dr. Shrikande introduced, my project is Convivencia and Music in Medieval Iberia. Before we start, I would just like to clarify a couple of those terms. If you're not familiar, Iberia is the Iberian Peninsula, what is now known as Spain and Portugal, but at the time those were not unified nations, so I'm calling it Iberia to be more accurate. And convivencia is a Spanish word which literally translates to living together or coexisting, but more than that, it's a cultural studies term that refers to the coexistence of different cultural groups in one geographic location and how they live together peacefully and share cultural aspects such as music. And so first, I have a brief timeline here to give an idea of the context. I won't go through each step of it. If you can skim it yourself if you would like, but I would like to emphasize that in 1085, Alfonso VI of the Christian kingdoms conquers the city of Toledo and declares himself emperor. And that's when the city of Toledo switches hands from Muslim rule into Christian rule. And around the same time, from 1073 to 1085 is when Pope Gregory VII made an effort to reform and unify the liturgy across the church, across Europe, across the world. And there was a sort of war of rights when local traditions tried to uphold their own traditions instead of conforming to the unified one of Pope Gregory. And those dates will become relevant later, so I wanted to emphasize them now. Okay, so going right into the technical stuff, we'll start with Al-Andalus, which is the southernmost, at one point it took up most of the peninsula, but the southernmost Muslim-ruled cultural community, geographic region of the peninsula. And it followed these Arabic music styles. I won't go into too much detail of them, but this first table is the pitch modes that they would follow. And I mostly want to emphasize that you can see it's a tetrachordal system, which means that there's 4 notes. So for example, in the first mode, you have F, G, A flat or A half flat, and B flat, and those would be the 4 notes of that mode that would be used for composition. And then in the next table, you see the rhythmic modes, and each one of those would indicate a speed and a division of beats or notes in a certain period, which the next thing that I want to go into is the periodicity of Andalusian music. So the music could be divided into a period. Each period has 2 cycles in it, and then the period could be repeated for various strophes of the poem, for example. And each cycle may or may not be in the same rhythmic mode, but it's the combination of modes and the variations within those modes that allows for the rhythmic constructions and the creativity. For example, you see in the example I have at the bottom, each cycle is a little bit different, but you would have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, and 3. And there you have a whole period, and that could be repeated, and the pitches on each of those notes is where you would get the melody from. And so also in Al-Andalus, in Andalusian literature, you have the poetic forms of the muashasha and the zahal, very similar. They're strophic in that there's several verses of similar rhyme scheme and subject matter. And that XX portion that you see in the diagram is the refrain that would be repeated in each strophe. And the YY figure is the harcha, which would be a separate couple of lines, maybe a couple of strophes at the very end. That would be typically in a different register or style or even a different language than the rest of the washasha before it, oftentimes more vernacular. And the difference in the zahal is that it would typically all be in a more vernacular style, and it would typically not have that harcha section at the end. And something really distinct about the Andalusian tradition is all of the various instruments that they have. They had several brass and wind instruments, particularly flutes, as they were very rhythm driven, several percussion instruments, but more than anything, string instruments, like the kanun, which is relative to the ancient harp, and the rabab, which you see pictured here, is a very early bowed string instrument and is often thought to be an early relative to the string instruments that we know now, like the violin. But most standard would be the 4-string lute, and you could have any number of variations of ensembles. You could have a solo vocalist, a solo instrumentalist, one solo, one instrumentalist, but most commonly you would have one singer accompanying themselves on the lute. That's what you would see most commonly. Here's just a couple more pictures, some artistic representations of musicians playing lutes and singing. All right, moving into the MOZARABIC rite, which is the general liturgical style and musical chants that would be used in the Christian churches throughout most of the Iberian Peninsula before the War of Rites, when the Gregorian reform started to take over a lot of those practices. And so you see on the left, the early notation is in Visigothic script and Visigothic pneumatic appearance, which, if you can tell, is very hard to read. It's non-diastematic, meaning that the figures are not heighted to indicate relative pitch or intervals of the melody. Basically, the figures just give a general direction of each note. It serves more as a reminder to someone who already knows the melody, the general direction that would go along with each word. As that practice developed, you got more of the Catalonian notation and Aquitanian notation coming down from the north, which is what you see pictured here. That's a lot more diastematic. It becomes a lot easier to read and to analyze. And then finally, around the end of the 13th century, you start to see a lot more of the Franconian notation and Ars Antiqua notation common in much of Europe at the time, that has staffs and clefs and standard pitches and standard appearances for the neumes or the little notes that make it much easier to read. And again, I won't go too much into the technical business of the pitch and rhythm, but basically the MOZARABIC chant would follow the general theoretical fundamentals of most European or Gregorian musical chant, be in these medieval modes, and the rhythm is not very definite or determinate. It's more subject to the natural scansion of the language or the singer's interpretation of the important syllables or words in the text. And then also, this is something that gets a little bit complicated, but on the ends of a lot of chants that end with the word Alleluia, there's a long melismatic ornamented figure on the antepenultimate syllable le, and there's typically a single note on the last syllable ya, but the lu is the penultimate syllable, is where you see a lot of variation among the Christian traditions. So the northern traditions like León and La Rioja might have 2 or 3 notes on that penultimate syllable, while the Toledo traditions, both A and B, that's 2 different styles within Toledo, typically just have a single note there. And that shows the distinction between those. And then I'll move into the Cantigas de Santa Maria, which are very interesting. For the purposes of my research, I've been focusing on the Toledo Codex, which is typically thought to be the earliest of the 4 extant manuscripts. It's the one that you see pictured here to the left. Basically, the structure of the Cantigas, at least in this manuscript, are that there's a prologue, 100 Cantigas or songs, where 9 of them are narratives. They tell the story of a miracle, and then 1 song of praise, and then that would repeat. And then there's 1 closing prayer, and then there's 3 appendices with additional songs. And several of these songs can be classified as mushasha or zahal forms which we saw in the Andalusian style. So the notation of the Cantigas de Santa Maria in the Toledo Codex resemble what we come to know as the Ars Antiqua style, but it's actually a little bit earlier than the standardization of that style. It's thought to be from about 1264 to 1276, somewhere in there. But you can see it's much different than the earlier Visigothic styles. It has a 5-line staff, it has a clef, it has relatively standard neum shapes, and it has the custos and small mensural periodic indicators, which are hard to see in this picture, but you can see a little bit better in this one. The custos is this small note at the very end that indicates the first note of the next line, so it's to kind of help the reader's eye know where they're going, and the small line right here indicates the end of a period. So the Cantigas de Santa Maria, though Christian in subject matter, are periodic, just like the Andalusian style. And you can see a little bit better in this transcription to the right. You can see the division between the cycles within the whole period. And then you can see in this diagram the sort of rhythm and scansion of this particular example. So, and I've added the counting numbers and symbols that you would use in modern rhythm. So it would go Pois que dos res nostro Senor, quis de seuli nas descer. And it would go on like that with each line. And so to compare those, the Andalusian and the Mozarabic styles have very different characteristics. I won't go through each of these because a lot of it's what I've already shown, but that they're very different. Though they coexisted, each one still had a distinct style. Though they both tended to show respect for the text and for the lyrics more than a lot of other things. So the Andalusian rhythms are very determined by the scansion and the rhythm found in the poetry, and the Mozarabic style didn't even have definite rhythm. It was all just based on interpretation of the rhythm of the poetry and the text. So though they do it differently, both have a strong respect for the importance of the text and the lyrics in the art form. And I also want to emphasize the significance of the distinct Toledan chant style. So we saw with the some of the notation and the Alleluia cadential forms that the Toledo tradition is different from the Leon and La Rioja ones. And a lot of those manuscripts that show the distinct Toledo style are from the 12th century, which immediately follows the War of the Rites in the 1070s and 80s. So it can be thought to be a sort of anti-Gregorian effort. They really emphasize and leaned into that distinct style of theirs as a way of resisting the unification with the rest of the church that was that Pope Gregory was trying to impose on the church. They rather were leaning into their own tradition and really trying to keep that alive and notate that. And then I would like to emphasize how the Cantigas de Santa Maria really show the hybridization of the Christian and Andalusian styles. Though I showed that they're very distinct and very different, the Cantigas are a very interesting way that they're combined. So the Cantigas de Santa Maria are very Christian in the way they're notated, the way their hexachordal pitch modes and their subject matter is obviously of a Christian nature. And the structure and rhythm, however, are often mushasha is a hall form. It's periodic. It's a lot more like the Andalusian style that we saw. And the notation and the pitch and the subject matter are things about the music that is a lot more obvious to the listener or to the reader in our case. And that's a form of overt culture, which is, more obvious, easier to define. And the structure and rhythm are a little bit more inherent to the essence of the music and the way that it exists in time and space. And that's kind of more of a form of covert culture, something that's harder to define, and it becomes quite interesting that at this time, by around 1264, when this manuscript was written, it was about 200 years after the Christians came to power in Toledo. So there's been a couple centuries for a lot of that hybridization to occur. And we can see it now that those aspects of overt culture are influenced by the Christian style, the people in power, while the Andalusian style, which the Andalusian people were not necessarily in charge in the church or in politics, but the group in power could not erase that covert culture that had worked its way into the art style in the community there. And so I've leaned into these things a little bit, but basically my conclusions are that a group may emphasize its own distinct style when facing erasure, like we saw with the Toledan RITE, and that's something that you might see in other cultural groups when they're facing erasure of their own style or their own traditions. That might be cause for them to emphasize it further. And similarly, as we saw with the Christian and Andalusian styles in the Cantigas de Santa Maria, that groups in power often control the overt culture and the things that are a lot easier to measure or to see, but they cannot erase the covert cultural aspects, like the rhythm and the structure and the music and various other cultural things. And something else that we saw just with the comparison of the Christian and Andalusian styles is that the diverse groups maintain their distinct styles. They don't necessarily lose their identity, but their coexistence, their convivencia, their living peacefully together can lead to the sharing and combining of their styles into one new unified culture that still includes, incorporates, and celebrates the distinct cultures of the diverse groups that make it up. And that's basically the end of my presentation. Thank you all so much. I look forward to answering any questions that anyone may have when we get to that portion of the session. Thank you.